Hello and welcome to everyone tuning in right now. My name is Jessica Paul and I'm the events coordinator for Munro's Books in Victoria, BC. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all tonight to the event featuring Gregor Craigie in conversation with Kathryn Marlow about his debut book, On Borrowed Time, North America's Next Big Quake. Usually we would host an event like this in the bookstore, but of course with COVID restrictions, we are unable to do so right now and have had to figure out a new way to celebrate books when we can't actually host book launches and author readings in the store. But it turns out there are actually some upsides as well to virtual events. I know quite a few of you are joining us from outside of Victoria and would not necessarily have been able to join us in the bookstore for an in-person event. And I'm so pleased that you can join us virtually instead. Before I introduce you to Gregor and Kathryn, I would like to acknowledge that this event is streaming from the traditional lands and territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, now known as the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. As Gregor recognizes in the very first chapter of On Borrowed Time, local Indigenous peoples have known about the geological risks we face here on Vancouver Island for generations. Oral histories passed down have told stories of great tremors and massive ocean waves, though early white settlers did not ever listen to them. It was these oral histories that finally helped geologists prove that the Cascadia subduction zone off the coast of Vancouver Island can in fact produce some of the world's largest earthquakes. This is just one example that illustrates the importance of Indigenous knowledge and stewardship, a relationship with the land that continues to this day. Tonight, of course, Gregor will be discussing his new book, On Borrowed Time, with Kathryn Marlow. And now to introduce you to our speakers. Our moderator tonight is Kathryn Marlow. Kathryn is a reporter and sometimes radio host for CBC Victoria, covering stories across Vancouver Island, the Gulf Islands, and the Sunshine Coast. Kathryn studied history, French, and political science at SFU and broadcast journalism at BCIT. And she has worked for CBC for over a decade. Most recently, she acted as the host of CBC's afternoon show, All Points West, from January 2020 until July of this year. Gregor Craigie, as I'm sure most of you know, is the host of CBC's On the Island, and he has worked as a reporter and journalist for nearly 25 years. After studying history at the University of Calgary and broadcast journalism at BCIT, he got his first job in radio reporting for CKWX in Vancouver. In 1999, he moved to the UK, where he joined the BBC World Service as a news announcer and producer. While in London, Gregor also reported for the American network CBS Radio, as well as freelancing for CBC Radio. Following his BBC, CBC, and CBS days, Gregor returned to Canada and to the CBC exclusively. He has been the host of On the Island since 2007. We are also extremely thrilled to share that just this morning, On Borrowed Time was nominated for the Writers' Trust inaugural Balsillie Prize for Public Policy. Congratulations, Gregor. That is amazing for your first book. And now please welcome Kathryn Marlow and Gregor Craigie.
Hello, are we both unmuted? This is the first test.
We're both unmuted. We've got our mics on, Kathryn.
We're going to succeed. Hello, Gregor, and congratulations on this this little feather in your cap that we just heard about this morning.
Thank you, Kathryn, and thanks for that very kind introduction, Jessica. Yes, I was surprised when I woke up this morning and found that this book is one of 4 shortlisted for the inaugural Balsillie Prize. The publisher nominated me, and I was just grateful that the 3 jurors shortlisted me along with 3 other writers for this prize that will be handed out in November. So it's a doubly good day here for my official start of my writing career.
Well, let's get down to it and talk about this book that you've put so much work into. And I want to ask first, you have been, as we just heard in your bio, a journalist for a long time. You've been working in this city for a long time, covering this province for a long time. There are so many things you could have written about. Why earthquakes?
Yeah, it's true. And I, to be honest, Kathryn, many times when I was considering writing this book years ago, I thought, this is not something I want to devote every waking hour that I'm away from work thinking about, because already we CBC journalists on the West Coast spend a fair bit of time thinking about earthquakes because, of course, it is a real and present natural hazard and risk to our cities. But to be honest, I think I'd been a reporter for several years, and when I moved to Victoria the first time I came here in 2003, and I was working at the legislature as the TV legislative correspondent for about a year and a half, I learned quickly enough from the radio reporters down in the basement radio press gallery of the legislature, where there are no windows. I was upstairs in the press gallery with the print reporters and a few other TV reporters, and we were way at the top, and the radio reporters were down at the basement, and the likes of Jeff Davies and Scott Sutherland and so on. Pretty soon, my first few days there, started joking in that journalist black sense of humor way about the big one and how they were all going to be buried in a pile of stones and rubble when the earthquake finally hit Victoria and the whole thing came smashing down. And at first I kind of laughed nervously and thought, no, they're just joking. It can't be that big. And then sure enough, I got my hands on an engineer's assessment report and talked to enough politicians, and never did a story on this because no one was really talking about it. But I asked around and around and around, and sure enough, there had been a proper engineer's assessment, and the building was vulnerable and could come crashing down. The whole dome could come crashing down, come off of the building and essentially collapse. And yet people were basically making jokes about it. Politicians, no matter their political stripe, would say, no, we're not going to pay a penny to fix this building until we fix the schools, which I understood, but it was still just surreal that we were all in this building that we knew could come crashing down someday, and nothing was being done to mitigate the risk. So it kind of grew from there. Then when I moved back here to be an early morning show host, my wife Becky and I came with young kids, our first baby walking around, and I just went from place to place to place that I had read about in my background reading or done interviews about, like Crystal Pool or unreinforced brick masonry buildings in downtown Victoria. And there I am carrying, a 6-month-old baby around in a sling and looking up and thinking, oh yeah, this is the place I read about yesterday at work that's forecast to come collapsing down. So I think I honestly became obsessed. I started reading about earthquakes in my spare time, worrying about them. And one thing led to the other. Eventually I could pitch no more interviews on CBC, Kathryn, about earthquakes. And I had to just start doing it in my own time and eventually working up towards a book.
Okay, there's so much to dig into there, but I do want to ask, because I have admitted this to you before. I grew up on the coast. I grew up in the Lower Mainland, and I was one of those people that when new people, I remember friends moving from Ottawa in high school, and they all of a sudden heard about this big one, and they're like, "What are you talking about?" And they were scared, and I was like, "Yeah, like it's just whatever. Like it's not a big deal. Don't worry about it." So where on the spectrum of local who totally dismisses the concern and new person who can't stop thinking about it, where should we actually be sitting in this as people living here?
Yeah, that's the point. And I think you've hit the nail on the head in the question. We have to be somewhere between those two extremes. The one that I think is more common among people who've lived here for a long time, and it's really understandable, for people who've lived here their entire lives, and maybe their parents lived here their entire lives and their grandparents lived here their entire lives, and nothing's happened. You can understand why they would say, come on, you can't worry about everything. Do you worry about an asteroid plummeting through the atmosphere and taking out your bed, as happened in Golden a couple of nights ago? You can't worry about everything in life. And I think a lot of people who've lived here forever, for their whole lives, have learned that for the most part, it's a safe place. And so they don't need to worry about it. That's the one extreme. And therefore, a lot of those people don't do anything. And then there's the extreme. People like me come from Alberta, or someone we both met recently, Kathryn, who came from Edmonton and saw the book we were talking about and said, wait a minute, is there going to be a huge earthquake? Can you tell me and my boyfriend? We've just come from Edmonton and we're worried about this. So you can either set your hair on fire or stick your head in the sand. And I really believe strongly, and all the more so after writing this book and interviewing countless people, that the answer, the correct response is somewhere in the middle. We cannot panic for something that may not happen for decades or even centuries from now, but nor should we put it off and just ignore it, saying it's not going to help. Because earthquake after earthquake around the world has proven that if you are prepared, you can save lives and you can save cities and communities and companies. But if you do nothing, you could be extremely vulnerable and so pay the ultimate price.
I want to get to preparation in a second, because that is sort of at the heart of this. But since you're talking about having, people who've lived here for generations, and Jessica mentioned it too, as with so many things that we are relearning or discovering, I put giant quotation marks around the word discovering there. People who are from here, Indigenous peoples here, have stories of earthquakes and have known. Can you just talk a little bit about about the knowledge that was here that settlers were not accessing?
Yeah, that was one of the most fascinating things I learned in the researching of this book, Kathryn, and it comes into play in this part of North America because I read about earthquake risks elsewhere. But here in British Columbia and Washington State and Oregon, the biggest concern, geologically speaking, is the Cascadia subduction zone, that long undersea subduction zone or trench or fault under the ocean floor west of Vancouver Island. And we now know that it last ruptured on June 26th, 1700. And it was just a remarkable piece of scientific sleuthing that uncovered it. And it was a triangulation. There were three broad areas that helped them discover it. And one of them was Indigenous oral history. And the various nations up and down the coast, all the way up from Northern California, up to the Pachena Bay and further north on Vancouver Island, told tales that they passed down the generations of a great shaking, followed by an enormous deadly wave. And this was exemplified by various mythical creatures, thunderer and various thunderbirds and so on, that would be having a great battle and it caused the earthquake, and then it caused the sea to come roaring in afterwards. Now, because of the long history of colonization and residential schools and so on, a lot of the specifics of this were lost. But after one of those three pegs of the triangle I talked about, a lot of the scientific research got going in the 1960s and then really picked up steam in the 80s. Geologists, scientists found a number of geological clues that there had been large earthquakes and what they thought were probably large tsunamis. So they were honing in on this. But then a geologist by the name of Ruth Litwin in the US went and started poring over First Nations accounts that had been brought in from various First Nations themselves, from anthropologists and the like. She started compiling all the different stories, looking for specifics. So she wasn't trying to dismiss any of the stories, but she was trying to put them all together, take in the accounts, compare what was similar, and then hone in on a date. And when she started going by specific stories, when people could count the number of generations back, then honed in on a rough time of about 1700, which was remarkable. And then when they put that, the indigenous knowledge along with the scientific knowledge, and they heard from a Japanese seismologist who had been trying to find the source for an orphan tsunami back in 1700. That is a tsunami that was not preceded by an earthquake that anyone in Japan found. There were very precise oral records, or written records rather, from samurai clerics back in late January 1700. And putting all of these three elements together, they could piece together that it was a monster. It was a magnitude 9. It had happened around 9:00 p.m. local time on January 26th. And it's the kind of thing that has happened more than a dozen times over the last few thousand years. So the indigenous component of that, to get back to your original question, was absolutely key and fundamental.
So now we know. I mean, we've talked about the big one. You know, I remember talking about it in the 90s in school. But we know it can happen. We can't do anything to prevent it. So what can we do, and what should we do?
Well, there's a few things. Actually, it's funny that I'll talk about what we should do to prepare in just one second. But I think one of the things that's absolutely key is to continue scientific exploration and engineering and technological research and innovation. Because when I think about the scientific research, you know, we say we know about the big one. But the truth is there are other, and we've discovered some of them in the time it took me to write this book, there are other closer, shallower crustal earthquake faults that are a threat to places like Seattle and Victoria. One was uncovered 3 or 4 years ago that comes up from under the Juan de Fuca Strait, the Salish Sea, and comes onto ground along the west shore of Victoria. It's a huge threat, maybe not as frequent as the Cascadia subduction zone, but it could cause a devastating crustal quake. I think we're going to hear even next year about another crustal fault in and around Greater Victoria that's another threat. I've talked to scientists in places like Nova Scotia, Quebec, and Ontario who say, we need to study more. And you know, some people, Kathryn, might think it sounds self-serving because they're in the business of doing research, but you know, you don't have to talk to them for very long, and you ask them the simple questions. How at risk is the city of Montreal, for instance, or how at risk is the city of Ottawa? And people say, And scientists, geologists say, well, this is a very frustrating question because we're trying to measure the natural hazard in order to tell you what the risk is to the particular city. But we can't actually do any more research on the natural hazard because we can't quantify the risk and so on. And so we can't get funding, and round they go. So that's a very long way of saying, I think we need to do a lot more research. But for those of us at home, I think we need to make sure, A, our earthquake kits are ready. And probably a lot of us watching have done that to some degree or another. Dust it off, make sure everything is still there, that the beans in the canned beans in your supply kit haven't gone bad, as does happen eventually, or at least according to put some cash in there, all sorts of other supplies. And it's easy to get a good list of that, water purification and so on. But beyond that, and that's an important step, but I think what we really need to do, and the conclusion I've come to and taken to heart personally, is we need to try to start getting our buildings ready. There are thousands of buildings that are vulnerable here on Vancouver Island and Metro Vancouver. And there are buildings that are vulnerable in Montreal and Ottawa and Quebec City and other Canadian and American cities as well. So that's not the kind of thing you can do overnight, clearly, Kathryn, as anyone who's tried to do a reno, especially during the pandemic, knows. But it's the kind of thing we shouldn't, again, put our head in the sand and say, well, I mean, what am I going to do about my house? I'm just going to say, que sera, I can't do anything about it. Well, no. Make a plan for a couple of years. Maybe you can hire an engineer or talk to your strata council or say, we're going to identify the problem in the next 5 years, and then maybe we'll give ourselves 5 or 10 years to strengthen the building we live or work in or what have you after that.
I mean, like you said, it's easy to go and find a list of things that should be in your earthquake kit. And we've got the annual Great Shakeout coming out next week where we're all going to be reminded of that again. But how do you even begin to figure out what state your home is currently in and what you can do to correct that?
It's a great question, and it really seems like a daunting thing to do. I think so many people just presume that their house or their rental apartment building or the condo is fine because, well, we're a developed country, we have a building code. That must have been taken into account when it was built. But of course, the building code is updated every 5 years. And when many people's houses and apartments were built like mine, there were no seismic provisions. So yeah, you do need it to need to have it assessed. I mean, in my case, after doing all of this research, I hired a local engineer, Graham Taylor, who's well known. He does seismic work for schools and the provincial government and so on. And he'll also do assessments for homeowners. So I paid him a few $1,000s for a full assessment of the house. And then he's drawn up a plan, and he's told me, he's given me a very scientific reading of the force of shaking it can take, and at what point I might expect total collapse of my 107-year-old, 109-year-old house, what point it might just be heavily damaged, and at what point it might actually withstand an earthquake and give me a place and my family a place to live afterwards. So that's one measure you can do, is you can hire a professional engineer. They are around. It's the kind of thing that can do. And I know not everybody's privileged to be able to spend the money, but you could contact an engineer or a building professional who focuses on it. Or if you're in a condominium, you could bring it up and for your strata board to discuss. If you're a renter, you could raise it with your landlord. And before renters watching tonight start laughing at me, I understand it's not always that easy, but maybe it's something you want to bring up at City Hall or with your local MLA or even your local MP, because as I talk about in the book, many other jurisdictions, cities and states and countries have brought in mandatory retrofit measures that force building owners to make their buildings safer over the course of a few years or even a few decades.
That theme comes up a lot in the book about the difference between encouraging and requiring people, building owners, to make adjustments, and also about this idea of sort of convincing people that it needs to be done, that is, even here and definitely in places like Montreal where you wouldn't think an earthquake happens, how do you convince people that this is a risk? But can you talk about some of the effective methods that where building codes or municipalities have made it so that building owners, especially landlords in apartment buildings, have no choice but to actually make adjustments?
Yeah, I think you see, Kathryn, maybe I can think of two really, in my mind, good American examples. One being from San Francisco, which is maybe more of the stick approach. And then another example in Seaside, Oregon, which some of our viewers might have taken a holiday at on the Oregon coast, which is more of a carrot approach. In San Francisco, I mean, they have so many risky buildings and they've suffered so much over the last 110 years since the giant San Francisco earthquake of 1906. And they've made made improvement after improvement over the years. But still, 10 years ago, they found themselves with this huge stock of vulnerable 2, 3, 4-story low and mid-rise buildings that were old and that had what they call a soft story. So the ground floor in some portion would only be supported by a few posts, or it would have a huge opening for a double garage, or there'd be a corner store, like a little mom and pop grocery store, with nothing but a couple of posts and all glass windows around the two main sides. And the reason they call that a soft story is because that's the vulnerable spot. Once the building starts shaking, most of it's robust except the ground floor, the soft story. And they knew from experience in San Francisco and elsewhere that those buildings collapse onto the ground. With maybe the top 2 or 3 stories intact, but the building is a write-off and people are crushed as a result. So San Francisco said, through a long process of debate and refining, we're going to require every building owner of one of these types of buildings to fix this. And we know that it's going to cost tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes hundreds of thousands, but it's just a price that they're going to have to bear. But what they did to try to ease the financial burden for owners is give them years, and depending on which ones and when people got started, over a decade in some cases. And so they gave them a date a few years down the line to have their buildings assessed. So that's what all building owners have to do. And they had to confirm this with the city, that a certified professional or engineer or other building expert assessed their building, gave it to the owner, then gave it to the city, and then they gave them X number of years to get it done. And they had the stick that I talked about, which was a financial penalty. They would put a giant red pasted placard on a building if it went past the deadline and hadn't been fixed, in English, Chinese, and Spanish, saying, this building has not been fixed, and preventing the owners from charging any rent to anyone renting there. So it was a financial imperative. Now, they've tried that in other places. There's a similar measure in Los Angeles. They tried it in Portland, Oregon, but there was huge pushback, and not necessarily just from the people you'd think, not just from business owners who, said, I don't want to pay the very expensive cost. There were even some poverty groups and social advocacy groups in Portland saying, well, just hang on a second, because if you do that, you're going to force some landlords to tear it down. Because if a property is going to incur $500,000 in retrofits, then maybe the owner will just tear it down. And then the people who are able to afford to rent a place there in a city with a low vacancy rate, does that sound familiar? May not have a place to live afterwards. So the stick is what a lot of cities, especially in California, have gone with, but it's a very controversial one for a lot of reasons. And just briefly, Kathryn, the carrot is Seaside, Oregon, where the longtime school teacher and principal and then superintendent Doug Doherty looked one day, before people were taking the tsunami risk seriously, around his sand foundation town at all the schools he was responsible for, and realized, not only, this was an assessment he got done, not only are they going to collapse in an earthquake, but within 15 minutes, they'll be swept away by a tsunami. So he started agitating and asking questions, and he got put off year after year. It's not your responsibility, Doug. This is not really something for a school superintendent. But he just kept finding, the more and more he went, no one was actually addressing it. So he pushed and he pushed and he pushed. And he was called a Cassandra, and he was called a worrywart, and he was doubted and laughed at over many years. But slowly, over the course of a few decades, he convinced a forestry company and the Oregon state government and local voters to support a pretty big investment, over about $100 million, to close all of the schools and rebuild one campus with all of the schools uphill on bedrock, well above the highest historical tsunami line. And he did not force anyone. He just spent years training staff in ham radio, making them feel empowered, like they could take small steps. And eventually he got there. And just recently, that new school campus is opened.
But not every city has someone like that.
That's for sure.
So we talked a little bit about what individuals can do, or what jurisdictions can do to take care of things like apartment buildings. Let's go back to the public buildings. This all started for you because you saw the bunker, as some people call it, the radio room in the bottom of the legislature. And you mentioned that politicians joke about the legislature, the legislative buildings. Maybe they're not going to do anything about it. They want to take care of schools first. We know that schools has been a long and drawn out conversation in this province. So where is BC at publicly when it comes to prepping schools, hospitals, the legislative building that many of us see every day?
It really depends who you compare it to, Kathryn. It reminds me of whether I feel tall or short or young or old, just to walking around crowds. And it depends who I look at. I mean, if we look at, if we compare ourselves to California, we're not really doing that well. I mean, California has improvements it needs to make as well. In fact, some giant ones with skyscrapers that I read about in the book. But by and large, California is way ahead of us. And in fact, the former BC Liberal government in around 2014 hired a former emergency head for the state of California, Henry Renteria, and he came up here and he did a full assessment for emergencies in general, but earthquakes in particular, and found BC lacking. So you mentioned schools. It's over budget, it's over schedule, but I would argue it's been largely successful. Slow, it hasn't got all the schools done, but I think about my 3 kids, 2 of them, they'll go to 3 different schools in Victoria, and 2 of those schools have been made stronger or replaced. So I think that's kind of a general rough estimation for how far we've come with schools in BC, which is to say slowly but surely we're getting there. But you know, there are bridges up and down the coast, and this is certainly the case for places like Montreal and Ottawa. There are so many brick buildings in a city like Ottawa around the Byward Market, or old brick warehouses in Montreal. And here on the coast in British Columbia, in a city like Victoria, we have hundreds of vulnerable buildings. Vancouver has hundreds of vulnerable buildings. In fact, an APEG, an Association of Professional Engineer assessment of the city of Victoria a few years ago, did a broad level, a kind of a 30,000-foot assessment of our buildings in the city of Victoria, and they concluded that hundreds could collapse in a major earthquake, and as many as 2/3 could be so heavily damaged as to be uninhabitable afterwards. Now, I've talked to a few engineers afterwards who've quietly said, yeah, that they were being really, really, really cautious. And I've heard a few engineers say it won't be that bad. It won't be 2 out of every 3 buildings. But imagine if it was 1 out of every 3 buildings in a city that you lost like that in an afternoon. What would happen to to everybody? Where would they go? Where would we eat and work and sleep and go to school? What would we be left with if that were to happen? So there are a lot of vulnerable buildings left to fix.
How do you find out if, we talked a little bit about apartment buildings and condos and stratas, but how do you know if the building that you spend lots of time in, whether you work in or live in or have regular appointments there, how do you know if that building is safe or not? Is there a way to find out?
The short answer is it's quite difficult. And again, I'd say this is where British Columbia is falling short. I mean, people naturally want to know. For instance, I talked to Perry Adbar, who is the head of civil engineering at UBC, or he's one of the lead professors of civil engineering at UBC. He's studied extensively the skyscrapers and the high-rises around Vancouver, the city of Vancouver. And when he started looking at this not that many years ago, he just realized what a lack of information there was. So with a team, he went to the city of Vancouver, and the city took him on, and they started working on this partnership to look at 350 buildings around the city of Vancouver to try to assess their seismic resilience level. So they're doing that, and that's a great step. You can go to Seattle once the border opens again for us Canadians for non-essential travel, Kathryn, and you can look, they've got this very detailed map that shows you, oh gosh, I can't remember, I'm gonna get Seattle and Portland mixed up, but hundreds and hundreds, maybe over 1,000. I think it might be 600 in Seattle, vulnerable brick buildings that are expected to either be seriously damaged or collapse in a major earthquake. You can zoom in on the equivalent of a Google map and see. I did this with one of my kids about 5 years ago on a holiday weekend. I didn't tell him I was doing this, but I was just kind of curious. We were walking up to the Space Needle, and sure enough, there is the building, and you look on the Seattle, City of Seattle seismic vulnerability map. There's a building, there's another one, they say. So, I mean, it's not foolproof, and there are so many buildings, but it's much more difficult here than it could be. But as I was mentioning earlier, you could hire an engineer, you could talk to the city. There are lengths you can go to which require a fair bit of work right now. And the easier it is, I think it's fair to say, the more people are likely to do it.
Yeah. I was struck reading the book about, I was seeing parallels between how we've been dealing with this emergency that we've been living in for the last 1.5 years. And also specifically how we dealt with or did not deal with the heat dome this summer, which was sort of seemed to catch a lot of people off guard in a very significant and deadly, literally way. Mm-hmm. Knowing what you know and having done all the research that you have done, How do you feel about emergency preparedness overall? And do you think we've learned anything through COVID and through this summer that might help us also prepare for earthquakes?
Maybe. I think you're bringing up the heat dome as a great example, and climate change in general, which precipitated the heat dome. I kept seeing similarities the whole way through writing the book, because in so many ways, they both seem just like these huge problems that on an individual basis, it's very tempting to say there's little, if anything, we can do about. And they're both problems that you arguably need collective action to do things about. Although maybe the heat dome in some ways is a good example to say that you can take individual steps. I mean, maybe you can plant shade trees for the long term over your house. Maybe you can get an air conditioner, although I know that that's a debated measure because of the question of whether it leads more to climate change and is counterproductive. But the point being, we can do things, we can take individual steps to get ready for it. But by and large, I think many people look at climate change and just feel defeated and feel that there's not much we can do because it's up to governments and powers that are much greater than us. And I think a lot of people feel the same way about earthquake remediation. Going back to your last question just a minute ago, Kathryn, how can we even find out if the office building I work in is safe?
Yeah.
This is a question where we live here in Victoria. There are provincial government buildings that are not yet fully remediated. And of course, civil servants will want to know that. There are people who work in private office buildings in various cities across the country and the US too, who don't know. And the truth is, you'd have to be a really squeaky wheel right now to find out. I mean, I'd rather be able to tell people who want to know, and sometimes who are desperate to know, well, this is what you do. You just go to City Hall and they'll tell you. But so often you'll just get a blank look. And that's one of the things we need to do to prepare, is get a full picture of all of the buildings in every seismic zone. And come on, in an era, I mean, I'm not saying it can be done overnight, but in an era when we can zoom in on everybody's house and go to Street View and look it up, and when we have so much data at our fingertips, it's not that unreasonable to think that in Canada and the United States, we'd have that kind of detailed information on all of the buildings that are paying taxes after all and that are registered with government and so on. So I would put that as a goal for the next decade or two, and that will certainly facilitate and speed up a lot of repairs and safety measures in response.
One of the other ways that people would like to get information on this, of course, is when. Is there a way to predict earthquakes?
No, that's the short answer. And in fact, I thought it was such an interesting question that I devoted a whole chapter to prediction, because all of I should be very clear, all of the scientists I talked to in this country and a couple of other countries all said, no, we can't predict earthquakes, and please don't give anyone the false hope that we're about to predict earthquakes. Now, we do talk about earthquake early warning, and a lot of us in seismic zones are getting used to this notion that if you put seismic sensors out under the ocean floor or a fair way off, wherever it is outside the city, and they can pick up the initial earthquake wave before the seismic wave makes it all the way to where you are, that you might get a few seconds or maybe even a minute or 90 seconds of warning. And that could be enough time to jump under a desk, or if a building is wired correctly, to bring the elevators down to the ground floor, or to stop a high-speed train, or to close off entry gates to tunnels and that kind of thing. That is possible, and in a growing number of countries around the world, including here in Canada, it's becoming more and more likely. But prediction is not possible. There's just too many variables. Scientists narrowed down the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake to a window of between 200 and 800 years. So they've got it down to this 600-year window. And I'm not making fun of them. I mean, it's amazing. I had so much admiration for the scientists and everybody else involved in figuring that out. So to expect them to go down to, a century or a decade or a year is too much right now. And all of the scientists I've talked to have said that the problem is, Kathryn, that there have been efforts over the years, some of them good intention, some maybe otherwise, to predict earthquakes, and they've caused an awful lot of public fear. And then, of course, the earthquake or the time has come and gone, and there's been no earthquake, and then that starts to build, understandably, more doubt. This has happened in places like rural Tennessee, in the New Madrid seismic zone, not too far from Memphis, or parts of California, where scientists, even some scientists and others, and journalists and others, have said, there's a whatever percent chance of an earthquake, and they've just scared people silly. But the problem is just one more thing to muddy the waters, that there is one example, and it's been confirmed by scientists, including scientists at the Geological Survey of Canada. There is one example from China in the 1970s when there was a swarm of earthquakes going through a region where zealous local officials, one who is nicknamed Mr. Earthquake because he had people on guard after months of tremors and unusual behavior, radon in well water, snakes slithering up through crevices in the winter and freezing to death, all sorts of strange animal behavior. People were highly on guard, and Mr. Earthquake felt a tremor one morning and evacuated thousands of people from a building. And it saved thousands of lives. And this is not just the Chinese government propaganda during the Cultural Revolution. This has been confirmed by all sorts of scientists around the world who've looked at this and independently said, yes, it was probably a lot of luck, but indeed they did predict the earthquake and they did save thousands of lives. But that's the only example. And not long after that, scientists missed one not far from there in China that had a devastating death toll. So the long and the short of it is, don't hold your breath for prediction. We need to get ready for an earthquake, not spend too much time trying to guess exactly when it's going to happen.
There is so much. We're going to switch over and let the audience ask questions in a second instead of just having me do it. There are so many little laneways and alleyways we could go down, stuff that you brought up tonight, stuff that I remember from the book. But let's just hope that everyone who's listening tonight is going to read the book so they can find all those things. But what is your message for people? They listen to you here, they do some independent research, they read the book, then what?
Then I would say, make a plan, because I think it helps with your mental state of mind. And one of the favorite people I interviewed for this book, and also for some work with CBC Radio beforehand, was Robert Gifford here in Victoria at the University of Victoria in their psychology department. He talked about the dragons of inaction, like these reasons we give ourselves for identifying a problem, but then not doing anything about it. And there are so many reasons that we do that. One of them, as we were talking about earlier, is, well, you've never experienced it in your own life. And then another big one is that you just think you can't do anything about it. You say to yourself, I can't stop an earthquake from happening, and therefore I'm not going to do anything about it, because when I think about the earthquake, I worry about it, but I can't stop it. Therefore, I'm going to expunge it from my mind. So I think some of the things we can do are to set ourselves longer term goals to try to help us calm down in the meantime, those who feel worried about it, to say, look, the odds are very slim that the next big earthquake is going to happen in the next hour. I mean, if you imagine the Cascadia subduction zone here is about a 1 in 10 chance in the next 50 years, and it may be some other form or some form of devastating earthquake, or pardon me, damaging earthquake in Victoria is a 1 in 3 chance of 50 years. That's higher, but what are the odds then of something happening in the next hour or the next day or the next week? They're pretty low, and they're the kind of levels of risk that we accept when we go out in our car or what have you, or maybe go on a plane on a holiday or what have you. So those are the kind of risks we just have to accept, but make a longer term plan. So for instance, maybe you think, well, I can't afford to hire an engineer if you own a home, but I can do it in the next couple of years. Or if you're in a rental apartment building and your owner has told you that despite the 3 steel posts at the back of the main floor, which mean that the building is unstable, that there's no plan to retrofit the building, and you've read enough about this and talked to people, and you know that your building is a bit dangerous. Maybe you say to yourself, I'm just not going to panic because the risk right away is not that high. But in the long term, given that I spend every night here, I'm going to set a goal of trying to move somewhere, and the next place I move to as a renter, and I know how hard it is to find rental places, but maybe I'm going to make the goal to look at the seismic readiness of the building for my next place. In the meantime, maybe I'm going to write a few letters to the mayor and city hall and my local politicians and see what else can be done. There's a lot of things we can do, and I think if we make goals for the midterm, Kathryn, then we might be saving ourselves down the line. And who knows, maybe we're making where we live or work safer for somebody 100 years from now. I mean, we literally could, with these decisions, be saving someone else's lives or protecting someone's safety a century from now.
Okay, I'm going to stop asking you questions and ask you questions on behalf of the audience. So if you missed Jessica's reminder at the beginning, Don't put your questions in the chat box, please. There's also a Q&A section. Depending on what sort of system platform you're using, it's either at the bottom of the screen or at the top of your screen. It's just this Q&A. So pop in there and write your question. Then I'll just be reading the questions and asking them to Gregor. So I'm going to start that now. This is from Ellen. We've kind of gone over this, Gregor, so I'm not sure how much more you can say, but let's give it a shot. She says, can you talk about how renters in 1970s era buildings can tackle this idea of getting buildings prepared? Please don't say, ask your landlord.
Yeah, no, so thanks for the question, Ellen, and you're right. I mean, I won't end. I will say ask your landlord, but I promise I won't end there because I understand why that's likely not helpful. But I do think that there are just, I've been astounded since moving to British Columbia and Vancouver 25 years ago by how many people just don't know, or they just say, they had a building permit and there was the code, so it's fine. I think the least you can do if you're concerned is make your landlord aware of that, but then don't stop there. I mean, one idea, as I mentioned, might be to, consider your next rental, because, even if it's 4 or 5 years from now, the risk is fairly low. And again, maybe you want to go to City Hall. But the other thing you can do, and I mean, if you really want to prepare, I've met people who've taken more extreme, and I don't mean that in a judgmental way, but more unusual protective measures in their own homes. There's a section in the book where St. Patrick's Elementary, the Catholic school in Victoria, knew it was at a seismic risk and parts of the building could collapse in an earthquake. So the parents group got together and they bought these incredibly robust steel reinforced earthquake desks. They're called lifeguard structures. They're built out of Seattle, and they were put in there. And you should see the video from lifeguard structures. And no, I don't have any financial stake in lifeguard structures. I don't know anything about them other than the desks I've seen in action. But they have a very interesting video where, they put these structures in an old, I think it was an 8-story concrete naval hospital in California that was about to be demolished, just to see how they would do. And they can take a huge amount of weight. And my point being that you can take all sorts of extra safety precautions in your apartment. But back to your point, a lot of 70s rental apartments are quite vulnerable, especially if they have parking on the main floor, taking away wall space. So I definitely take the point of the question.
All right, and invest in some sort of structure, I guess, if you can, an earthquake desk.
That's right.
So we got another question here. How long will it take to make every building and house safe from an earthquake?
A long time. And so this is, I appreciate that question. And I don't, I don't want to read too much into your question, but if you're thinking it will take too long and it's not very realistic, you may be right. And I think that's one of the reasons that a number of cities and a number of people, again, have done nothing instead of starting to chip away at it. I talked to an emergency management specialist and professor at the University of Utah, who's lived through earthquakes in India. And she tried to steer me, and she tries to steer a lot of people away from just focusing on fixing our existing buildings. I mean, in Salt Lake City, they have a surprisingly large number of brick buildings. And so there's a modest program in Salt Lake City called Fix the Bricks, where they offer homeowners a bit of money, to stabilize and get a professional in and do the various measures you can do to make the brick walls more robust and less likely to fall down. But Professor Chandrasekhar said what we really need to do is not spend small amounts of money on that. What we really need to do is spend huge amounts of money on making more social and affordable housing so that people are less likely to be in need of housing when it happens. And so, I think there's a point to be made that probably if the earthquake happens, a big one happens in the next few decades, we are not going to fix all of our buildings. I don't think we will. I mean, it would be good if we could, but even that is a question. I mean, it's not really realistic to think we could do it in the next few years, but I think it is something that should be done for public safety in a methodical way over the next few decades.
Okay, here's a great question from Charlie, who says, what about the vulnerability of undersurface infrastructure, sewers and water mains and utilities? Charlie says you can't stay in your house if you can't flush the toilet. I'm going to amend that with, is it possible that we will be sort of camping out in our homes without having running water for a while after an earthquake?
Yes, and thanks for bringing that up, Charlie, because I mean, Christchurch, which happened 10 years ago now, and anyone who's been there knows how similar it is to Victoria, but also other parts of of our cities, Vancouver and parts of Seattle and Ottawa, if you walked around their old brick buildings before the earthquake, not only did they have so many buildings come down, but their underground infrastructure was just destroyed. And so specifically to your question, Charlie, yes, if it were to happen today, absolutely. I mean, I hope, I'm doing seismic retrofits on my house now, and I hope that in a couple of years when they're done, that they will mean, and the engineer I've hired has told me it's likely that it will mean your house, my house, will withstand a very large earthquake. But to be honest, I do not think, A, that the electricity is going to be on. I don't have gas because of the earthquake. That's a decision I made. I don't think the water is going to be there, which is one of the reasons we're trying to store hundreds of liters and have bought water purification. But this is another issue, absolutely, that our cities and other governments and utility regulators need to do more about. Arguably, the short answer to your question is we should not expect to have any of those things, even if we have a roof over our head and can stay dry inside at night.
All right. Lots to think about and prepare for. Here's a question from Liz. She says, could Gregor give examples of the types of recommendations an engineer might have for a single family dwelling in Victoria?
Yeah, and if you don't mind, Liz, I'll tell you what the one was for mine. So I hired the engineer and he looked, we have a 2-story, 100-and-something-year-old house. And he honed in on what he says is the most common vulnerability on old wood houses. And I appreciate that's not what everybody has. I mean, a brick building, of course, is different. But for most of us on the West Coast, our single family homes are wood. And the good news about wood is that it's more flexible than brick and it absorbs a lot of motion. And a lot of wood houses tend not to collapse in moderate or even fairly big earthquakes. But when they do, most of them, the old ones anyway, do on the basement wall. So between the concrete foundation that might come up to your knee or so in the basement and the floor joist of the main floor is what's called the pony wall or the cripple wall. Ours is about 4 feet, and it was built in 1912 with these old growth Douglas fir 2x4s. And then they took the forms from the concrete and they just nailed them along to hold the 2x4s together. Well, once the earthquake starts going, the 2x4s start going like that, and then the boards, the nails start to loosen, they pop out. And I've seen this at the shake table that they have at UBC in Vancouver. And eventually they come and they pop out, and then there's very little structure, and then the main floor and the upper floor of the house collapse onto the basement wall. So what's been prescribed for mine is very specific, and I've got the building plans and I'm just starting it now, is to replace those boards that are nailed in onto the 2x4s with 3/4 inch thick plywood. There's all sorts of extra bracing and blocking that goes in and a nailing pattern, and he's got a cut along the middle so you can have horizontal motion going in a different way. But basically the engineer devises and draws up a very specific fix to make those wooden basement walls much more robust. Now, in some houses, experts and engineers will encourage you to bolt the house to the foundation. In my case, he didn't. He said, in your case, you're just going to get a leaky basement. And for various reasons that I won't go into because I'm not an engineer and I don't want to misrepresent it, he said it's not necessary in your house. In some houses it is, but that's a specific example. And there are many others of fairly simple things. You can also brace your hot water tank. You can go to your local hardware store and get a kit specifically for earthquakes to strap it down. I mean, that took me about 15 minutes to do that. You can buy T-joints from a company called Simpson's to put in your basement on the posts and beams. You follow their nailing instructions. It makes the horizontal, the vertical post supporting the horizontal beam less likely to pop out in an earthquake, which it sometimes does. There's all sorts of small, very practical fixes like this that an engineer or other professional can recommend. And in many cases, that homeowners with a few basic tools, paying very careful attention to the engineer's instructions, can do themselves.
Okay, here's a question from Don and or Ella saying, AI has been used to classify most of the trees in Greater Vancouver. Has this technology been used to flag buildings potentially at risk? I don't know if you know the answer to that, Gregor, but we'll ask you anyway.
Yeah, that's thanks for the question, Dawn. In fact, one of the interesting innovations of that, and it's being used in various seismically vulnerable places around the world. But one of the interesting companies that's really innovating that is in Quebec, and of course I'm going to forget the name of it. But in Montreal, a couple of engineers have been working on this because to the point of there being a lack of labor, of people to go and assess every building. I talked about that as that wide 30,000 foot assessment of the city of Victoria. they were looking at building types and on a block by block, street by street basis, but they weren't going into every building and assessing. I mean, that would take a huge amount of time. But artificial intelligence is being developed, and it's one of the many exciting developments that can help both identify buildings at risk and make us better aware of what buildings need more urgent attention beforehand. It can also be crucial after the fact. When we have a city and that's been hit by a large earthquake, and let's say you have thousands of houses that are damaged, and they look damaged, but the engineers are in short supply because they're looking at the massive buildings in the center of a city or the infrastructure that's damaged. What do individual homeowners or strata units or what have you do? There's another possibility with that kind of artificial intelligence outside assessment to save time and get people back in their homes more safely. Because remember, if your house appears damaged and you don't know whether it's safe or not after an earthquake, you could be out of your house or office for days, weeks, even months on end waiting for someone to assess it. So lots of other new innovations, wraps of brick building using carbon fiber technology, and all sorts of innovations that some of which I get into in the book in some length. And it's exciting to see some of these innovations being developed to make our cities safer.
Okay, here's a question that might be another one you can answer from your personal experience as a homeowner. Karen says, if you spend $2,000 to have an engineer assess the stability of your home or your building, and then you take the necessary action, does this reduce the cost of earthquake insurance?
That's a great question, Karen. And to be honest, I don't know because I'm not there yet. If you can come up with an argument and just email it to me after I'm just kidding. I don't know is the short answer. In my view, it should. And I have heard anecdotally that it does, but I cannot say that I've verified that with any insurance company. I certainly hope it's going to be the case. Just as a tip, and this may not apply to many people, but if you're considering earthquake insurance, and you have, and you've recently seen your earthquake insurance rates go up, you may want to consider just going with the bare bones earthquake insurance, because I know we reduced ours a while ago because once I looked into the finer points of it and it was costing me several hundred, maybe $600 or $700 more a year, I asked if there was any way about reducing the earthquake insurance. And the adjuster said, well, not if you want to have your contents insured. Some things are just priceless, she said, like paintings and works of arts and so on. And I just thought to myself about our kind of university student style and the fact that we could probably replace everything at the local Salvation Army. And I thought, no, I can live without that. I just want the house insured. Thank you very much. So that was a practical way of saving money. And I hope the earthquake retrofit will too.
Okay, you'll have to tell us about that in the sequel to your book, right?
Right, exactly, yeah.
Here's a question that we should have gotten to earlier and we didn't. So Craig, thank you for asking it. Are there plans to seismically upgrade the BC Legislative Building? Not
yet. And if there are, they're awfully well hidden. This just shows you the way politics goes. I was in there a couple of years ago speaking with the speaker and another member of the speaker's office about possibilities, floating some early ideas of coming up with a legislature building, parliament building retrofit. And then a couple of months later, let's just say political happenings and developments overcame that office, and there was a whole personnel change. And lo and behold, that talk of seismically retrofitting the BC legislature, which was at a very early stage and nothing concrete had been decided, well, those were back off the table. So the short answer is no. And again, I've talked to, since this book has come out, I've heard from a few former assistant deputy ministers, former cabinet ministers who said, we were right, just in case you think we were wrong, it was not right to come up with a plan and spend hundreds of millions of dollars, taxpayer dollars, to fix that building for politicians and staff when we hadn't fixed all of the schools. So I respect the answer and I understand the point. But to answer your question, as of the last time I checked, no, there is no plan to seismically retrofit the BC legislature. And if there is, please tell me, because I think we'd like to talk about it on CBC Radio in the morning.
No, tell me. Okay. Another question here, and this is more about people wanting to do, take care of or take on some things themselves. What department at Victoria City Hall would be worth talking to about seismic, dangerous, or safer buildings? Do you know?
Yeah, I think where you want to start is the building or permit department. I've been down to the departments just as a homeowner in both Oak Bay and Victoria, where I've lived at various stages of being here, and found that as long as I was patient, and I actually had to go back in both municipalities a couple times to figure out the right time of day, but the city staff in both places were very helpful and willing to talk to me about it, and also very clear. Well, look, we can't tell you about your house, but here are some obvious places you might want to start. I mean, in the end, I learned most of it from engineers that I've spoken to and later on hired. But I think, you know, you can go down to City Hall and ask to speak to someone in building permits about what kind. I mean, here's some questions I would ask very quickly. What kind of seismic retrofit building permits have other homeowners applied for? There's a good starting point, because I mean, there are a number of retrofits that are listed for other reasons, but I know for a fact a number of people get permits to do seismic retrofit work. So that might be a nice place to start, and try to find a time when it's good, when there aren't a lineup of contractors out the door. But that might be a good starting place if you don't want to hire a professional first off, right off the bat.
The last question I'll put to you, I know we've just got a couple minutes left. I'm glad was asked, because it's another thing that I didn't get to ask you in my time with you. And this person asked if you could talk specifically about the risk in Ottawa, but maybe just give us an overview of how this isn't just a West Coast problem, which is an easy assumption that we often make.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the question about Ottawa. It's such a great city, and I've never lived there, but I've spent a lot of time over there over the years in Ottawa, a fair bit of time working there briefly with CBC Radio. I mean, the short answer is that a lot of Ottawa is very robust and well designed for earthquakes. But you think of areas like the Byward Market or anywhere with low to mid-rise brick buildings that are unreinforced and built before seismic retrofits required reinforcement. Those are probably the greatest risk. And the other risk in and around Ottawa and other places, other similar cities, is just unstable soil, Leda clay. So I mean, my house, for all its vulnerabilities, and despite the big earthquakes we expect here in Victoria, my house is built on bedrock. But you go to an Ottawa suburb like Orleans, for instance, and there is a lot of clay under an awful lot of neighborhoods. And so what you have in some cases in these modern suburbs is houses that are extremely well built, and they're built to a very modern seismic code. So the houses are not likely to fail on you, but the problem is that the soil under the house may. So sometimes you see, like the 1995 Kobe earthquake in Japan, you saw these very well built 6-story apartment buildings that did not fail. They didn't collapse or break or suffer catastrophic failure, but the ground liquefied under them. And you have, like, imagine my room is a 6-story apartment building, and the whole thing, there's a famous photo from Kobe with, I don't know, 3 or 4 buildings leaning out like 45 degrees. I don't know if it's 45 degrees, but a long way back. So the soil underneath is a concern. This is very similar in Montreal. There's so many old brick buildings and stone buildings in Montreal, and not just apartments and stores in downtown or Vieux-Montréal, but old warehouses that haven't been fully assessed. It's certainly the case in Quebec City, in New York City, in Charleston, South Carolina, a mixture of vulnerable old buildings and soft soil. And the other one last thing I'll say about Eastern North America, Kathryn, is that earthquakes in general tend to travel further in Eastern North America because of the geological makeup, a lot further than they do here. So similar magnitude earthquake that originates near us in Victoria or in California won't travel in as great a distance as it will in Eastern North America. And the one final thing I'll say about Eastern North America is every geologist and seismologist I spoke to about Ottawa or Quebec City or New York or Memphis or Charleston said, we don't know enough about earthquakes in Eastern North America. And they were all quite concerned about it.
Well, Gregor, I know a lot more about lots of things earthquake related because I read this book. So I thank you.
Thank you, Kathryn.
I am with the bookshelves that I knew were not very smart in my apartment building. So that's my first step.
Don't forget to bolt the little L bracket on your bookshelf.
Exactly.
I have not once used that bracket. I really should.
Exactly.
Oh man.
Yeah.
Well, I
think we'll throw it back to Jessica.
I think we all have a lot to think about, and to go home and look at our homes really carefully and critically to think how we can move forward. I myself, I don't even have an earthquake kit, and clearly I have some preparation to do. Thank you so much, Kathryn and Gregor. This was fantastic. It was completely fascinating. We've posted the link in the chat a few times for people. The book is available through our website. We have it here at Munro's. We do have signed copies as well. Gregor was kind enough to stop by a few weeks ago and sign them for us. We only were able to cover so much in this hour. There's so much more information in the book itself, focusing both here locally, but also across North America. And it's just like all those places that I had no idea that really Eastern North America was in a an active seismic zone. So that's just like mind-blowing to me. I also really want to congratulate you again, Gregor. This is so exciting that you've been nominated for the, let me remind myself of the name of the prize because I've already forgotten it, the Balsillie Prize for Public Policy, which I should mention, it is a new prize that the Writers' Trust has been this is the inaugural prize for it, and it recognizes nonfiction books that advance policy discussions about social, political, economic, and cultural topics that are relevant to Canadians. And if ever there was a book that fits that descriptor, it is On Borrowed Time. Thank you, everyone who attended tonight. I know lots of our lives are happening on a screen right now, so taking the time to actually join us on Zoom is really special. I also want to thank your publisher, Gregor, for publishing such a needed and fascinating book, Goose Lane Editions. And
yes, thank you,
yeah.
Thank you, Goose Lane.
Yes, and for their help organizing such a fantastic event too. So thank you both. This was wonderful. There was a question in the chat about if this was recorded. It has been recorded, and we'll be posting it on our YouTube page probably by the end of the week. We'll also send it out to everyone who registered tonight, so you can, if you missed part of it, you can check out the whole thing later. So thank you again, Kathryn. Thank you for all of your work in preparing your questions. I know how much work goes into that.
All good.
Yeah,
I'm glad I read the book. It forced me to read it, so that's good.
Yeah, well worth it, I think.
Yes.
And thank you all again. Have a wonderful evening. I wish we could continue this forever. There's obviously so many more questions. I know that there were unanswered questions in the chat, but hopefully, if you buy the book and read it, maybe some of them will be answered. Thanks again. Have a wonderful evening. Take care.
Thank you.
Good night.